Welcome to Change My Relationship. I'm very happy to have one of my dear friends in the studio with us today. Her name is Christine Lister. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist. I knew her first when she lived in California and was first licensed here. She's now licensed in Tennessee. We'll give her contact information, of course, in the at the end of the podcast and also in the written description. But for today, we're going to talk about Christine's personal experience with grief and the grief process. And we're also going to help you understand what it is to go through grief yourself. And that is one of the things, ironically, that Christine specialized in even before she experienced her own significant grief in her life. So,
Mhm.
welcome, Christine.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
So we're just going to jump in and give you kind of an idea of what was Christine's marriage like to her husband, John. Can you tell us?
Sure. So John and I were married for 24 years. I was 22 when I met him, and my relationship with him was really the healthiest I ever had with a man. We had opportunities to minister together. We did youth ministry, marriage ministry, prayer ministry, a bunch of different things together. We raised a daughter together. So Evie was 18 when her dad passed away. We both came from dysfunctional homes. And so we knew that we were unskilled. And so we really pursued things like marriage retreats and classes. And I jokingly said that God led me to be a marriage and family therapist to first help my own marriage because we definitely needed practice in that area. Um, so 5 years into our marriage, I actually discovered what I call the one kind of black spot in our marriage. John had a secret porn addiction, and he had disclosed to me beforehand that he struggled with that. And I thought, okay, well, he dealt with it, and you know, the past is the past, or whatever. Now, you have to put this in context because this was in the early 90s and the internet was just taken off, early to mid 90s. And so, whereas before you had to go really find, porn, now it was in your home at your fingertips. And so, unfortunately, that would pop up from time to time in our marriage. But I know that wasn't his heart. And so we kind of weathered that. I don't really talk about that too much in the book because I didn't feel like that particular detail was all that relevant. But when I talk in person with people, I do mention that. And part of it too is to honor his memory. I know that at his core, John was a godly man. And I think of like King David, he was called a man after God's own heart, but he had sin in his life that would pop up from time to time as well. And so I kind of think John, was like that. And we worked through it and we tried to, have as honest of a relationship with one another as possible. And I feel like, we did that.
Yeah, that's really interesting because most people that have dysfunctional family backgrounds end up having a dysfunctional marriage. But you two had the wisdom and insight and the desire to rectify that together, which is really unusual, but an incredible blessing.
It was. And like I said, the marriage retreats, the couples classes, all the stuff that we went to, Fullerton Free Church was instrumental in the beginning for us to really learn how to communicate. It was almost comical, but these are typically things that I now teach other couples how to do that don't have that foundation of how to communicate effectively.
Yeah. Well, tell us about the day that John passed away.
So I've often referred to that as the worst and the best day of my life. The worst, obviously, because my best friend died unexpectedly, and we were not, that wasn't on our radar at all. And it was the best because unbelievable how much support and, just presence of people. There was an outpouring of support from all of our church communities that we had been involved in over the years. Like, just everybody came and they just wanted to, how can I help, and this and that. He had been recovering from a cardiac ablation surgery because he had AFib, and he
Mhm.
wasn't recovering great, but it was slower. And we even thought that he turned a corner, and then just abruptly he died. I don't know, like, how detailed you want me to get on what exactly happened, and I do mention it in the book. Did you want me to share that?
Just briefly, I mean, maybe how your daughter found him and how you were like notified and then the support that you got right away.
Okay, so I left for work early that morning. Well, not early, but early in the morning to go to the office. And I actually stayed as long as I could. We were just kind of sitting on the couch together. She was dealing with a cold, Evie was, and so she stayed home from school. She had just started college, community college. I'm 5 miles down the road. And after my first session, my daughter sent me an SOS text, and then she called me right away. And so thankfully I was on break. I could take her call. And as soon as I answered, she says to me, Dad passed out in the shower. I called 911. The paramedics are here. And I was like, okay, do you need me home? Like, I was thinking at that moment when she shared that, okay, he had a setback and they're stabilizing him, and I still have work to do, And I asked her, I said, do you need me home? And she said, yes. And I said, okay. And I didn't question that. So I leave work and I'm driving home, and all of a sudden I hit this red light that's just really long. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to call her back. Is she okay? She found her dad passed out in the shower. Like, that's got to be kind of traumatic. And so when I called her back, the paramedics had told her by then that your dad had died. And when I'm calling back and they say, "Oh, don't tell your mom that your dad died," because they were afraid that, like, I'd get in an accident or something. So she held her peace, which is a big burden to put on an 18-year-old. And so when I asked her directly, "How's dad?" she just said, "I'd rather not say till you get here." And
Mhm.
what's interesting is I feel like the Lord kind of shielded me from any kind of forecast, like later, like somebody said, well, wasn't that a clue? And really it wasn't, because I think the Lord was just trying to, keep me together until I got there. So when I got home, it was a little bit chaotic because there was my practically my whole street was blocked off with like a fire engine and the ambulance, and then my neighbor's car, and I was like, where am I going to park? And when I walked up, the paramedic met me coming out the front door and said, your husband's dead. Like, I don't even remember what he said exactly. But when I got there, in my mind, John was still alive. So I thought, again, we're going to stabilize him, see what's going to happen. And it was just a shock. Like, I literally like just yelled out, "What?" when they told me that. And I just couldn't, I couldn't like believe it. Like, I left him this morning. He was fine. I come home, he's gone. Like, what are you talking about? And so when I went back to see him, the paramedic was trying to prepare me, but because he had passed out in the shower while the water was still running, and my daughter didn't discover him for some time, his body blocked the drain and it created a flood in my home. So I came home to a dead husband and a flood.
Right.
And so that's what I walked into. I won't go over the logistics of what happened after that.
Yeah.
That's in my book. But I made a couple of SOS phone calls to people because I literally did not know what to do. Like, it was just too overwhelming.
Of course.
And then yeah, people started coming over, and they were asking me, like, what do I need? What do I need? And I finally said, what do I need? I need someone to come here with a guitar and fill my house with worship, because I just lost my best friend and I don't know what else to do. I called it my Job moment. I was like, what else do you do?
Well, and I think, and I'm knowing you and your relationship with the Lord and how close you are to the Lord, it makes sense that you would say that. But I think the wisdom or just the insight that you had to just bring that worship and all into your house amidst that craziness is
Yeah.
just, it's a picture to me about how we should respond if we can when
Hmm.
disaster hits, is to just turn to the Lord. We can't fix any of it in that moment. And what else could you do? But, people come over, you're in shock, but that peace in the midst of that turmoil and that chaos and that unrest and that shock is just really kind of a testament to you and your relationship with the Lord, but also kind of how you navigated this whole journey with God. You call him Papa God in your book, and it always makes me think of the shack. But I just think of, he is our Papa. It talks about him
Yeah.
being and you're from Greece, so your dad was your Papa, right? That's what you call him in Greece, right?
Yeah.
And in the Bible, it talks about him being our Abba, our Father, our Daddy, and
Right.
yeah, and that you definitely turn to him to hold you up and lead you and guide you through that. And so that I think will come out in as you're sharing with the different things. But can you talk to us about your initial grief? We know as therapists that the first is shock, denial. And you feel that for quite a while. And life is a little bit difficult. And you had to leave your house. So you had
I
not only
did.
had the shock, but the disruption of having to leave your house and then, quickly deal with all the insurance and the things that had to do with getting the process of fixing it, which you said took over a year. And
Hmm.
but that initial shock, what was that like? What could somebody identify with if they've been through grief? And we should say we're talking about the grief with the loss of a husband here.
Hmm.
You Grief is for different things, but the process of grief is basically the same for any loss that somebody would be dealing with.
Right. And I think, a significant loss is more impactful, obviously, than like an extended relative or somebody you haven't seen in a while. And when I've kind of taught on grief, I've mentioned to people that, your grieving doesn't always necessarily seem to make sense. For example, some years after John died, somebody famous lost their dad, and it was on the news, and it kind of was a resurgence of grieving for me and my daughter, not because we knew the person, but because it was again somebody else that we had heard of that had a similar loss, and so it became a representational reminder of our own loss. But the initial kind of shock and grief that I had, you know it was more about like, oh my gosh, like what just happened? Like reality, it's hard because reality doesn't like come crashing in all at once. Like our brains like kind of, like we have a sense of what our reality is. And when there's like a pronounced shift like that, it takes a while for it to kind of penetrate into the deeper recesses of our thinking. And so while I was just trying to deal with the professionals in my home, and there was logistics because they couldn't identify what caused his death. So they had to call the county coroner. And so there was more people in my house that were strangers, even as the initial people were coming over to kind of offer me support. Because honestly, like I just wanted a friendly face because I had all these strangers in my house, and it just was very intrusive and felt violating in a way, but I knew that they were there for a reason. It's not like they were trying to be, intrusive. They were just doing their job. But when I would have people come over that were friendly faces, that helped to kind of calm me down. Like I felt like, oh, somebody's here who loves me, who knows me and my husband. But the initial, like there was points when it would like puncture through, and oh my gosh, the pain that I felt, like a literal pain in my heart. And I recall one of the times, this was, I think, after somebody had come over, there was a couple of, people from my worship team at the church I was attending at the time that came over and was playing guitar. And I remember sitting on a chair in my living room, and it like, it just hit me like, John is gone. And I just was crying, like, like just really crying hard. And I forgot this, but my pastor was there, and he said, when that hit me, I kind of held up my hand and I said, "Excuse me, I need to grieve for a moment." I just thought, I forgot I said that, and I think what I was trying to do was don't shush me, because a lot of times, like when somebody's hit with that wave of like pain and sorrow, they need to get it out.
Yeah,
And others feel like they have to come and like, oh, like, wait, it's going to be okay. At a deeper level, I knew I was going to be okay, but that pain had to have an outlet. It had to come out of my body. And so it was really, really pronounced, and then yeah, just very painful. But also necessary and cathartic. And I
hmm,
remember like my daughter coming in when she heard me, because at the moment she was outside in our backyard with her friends. And I told her, I had to kind of pull it in because I was starting to hyperventilate.
yeah,
And in my mind, you're going to laugh, but this is just how I operate. Like in my mind, I'm like coaching myself, and I'm like, okay, you need to breathe. You need to breathe. It's going to be okay. I'm like, like trying to get oxygen in my body so I didn't trigger a panic attack. And then my daughter's coming, and she's like on her knees in front of me, and I told her, I said, it's okay, I'm okay, this is necessary, like this is real, and we have to get this out. And so I wasn't embarrassed to like express that.
hmm.
It wasn't easy to have an audience, I'll admit. But what's interesting in the days following, like sometime after, um, have you heard of keening?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so I was still feeling so much, just sorrowful energy trapped in my body. I thought, like, what is going on? And I call it a wail cry, like you're wailing. And it's actually a term called keening. You can look it up. And it's where you're, it's that deeper kind of like just from the depths of your lungs and your soul, where you're just like, where it's not a very pretty sound.
Can imagine it.
Yeah. But when I would do that, this was not the day, but after, and I would allow myself to do that. It was very energy draining, but it was also like relieving. And I would wait till my daughter was like in the shower or something, or not in the house, and I would just kind of like give myself permission to do that. Um, and I had heard from other people that, and what's interesting is if you look at some of the cultures, they have like the wailing women,
Yes.
wailers, that cry out. And there's something cathartic in that. And I didn't realize that. And it is draining though. It's very draining, but it's also helpful. And that's not something that, you think about or like would typically identify as part of grieving. We talk about crying, but this is a deeper cry.
Well, and I think it's good that because not everyone gives themselves permission to do something that feels so like unnatural, or on the one hand it feels unnatural because we repress our emotions so much, and on the other hand
Right.
it is natural, like you're saying, it is something where it's just that deep cry. And I know there's scriptures in the Bible that talk about that, and I know there was
Mhm.
times that David described that. And, Jesus was in tremendous anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Right.
And maybe, I mean, with his prayer to where his body even sweat drops of blood. And there is actually a physical phenomena where that can happen.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's really healthy that you gave yourself permission to do that. Uh,
Hmm.
and one of the reasons probably why I mean, you were very intentional in your grief process, and you're healthy. You are a therapist, but you also, walk a walk where you do live in a healthy place and you understood grief. So you were able to give yourself permission. But I think that's neat because it gives the listeners permission to be honest and real and raw with their own grief and how it needs to be expressed.
Right. Right. And, just a little side note on this too. I've mentioned this before. I mention it in the book, and I also mention it when I'm counseling people. A grief process, partner, you need to really evaluate who those people are.
Mm.
And, because not everybody is going to be comfortable with, expressions of grieving. And, that's unfortunate, but that's just, it is what it is. And so I think wisdom dictates that you kind of, make sure that whoever you're, expressing your sorrow with is a good process partner. And if they're not, it's okay. It's okay. There's some people are going to go on the journey with you and some are not.
Yeah, I think I've heard people say that people are there right at the beginning through the memorial service, and then they kind of go back to their own lives and they
Mhm.
almost have this feeling of, well, okay, now you need to move on. And they don't, one of the things that people have said most to me about grief is that nobody knows how to stay with me for the long haul. They expect me to be better quickly. And how can you be, whether it's a loss of a child? And that even means sometimes partners, like spouses, like,
Yeah.
a step parent or a grandparent or somebody who just doesn't understand, or a friend that doesn't understand that lengthy grief process. So I think that's really good that you were able to do that. And thank
Mhm.
you for sharing that.
Sure.
You describe your grief journey with metaphors in the book, which I have to say I really enjoyed. I did forget
Yeah.
that at the beginning of the podcast. I really enjoyed. I found your writing style just really beautiful, raw, but very with a lot of prose to it, and just it was very easy to read, and it pulled you right in there. So you definitely are a gifted writer, and
Thank you.
I hope to see you write more. If that should be something you want to do. So, but you describe your grief journey with metaphors, and the first was about puzzle pieces. So tell us about that metaphor, if
Yeah.
you would.
Yes. So right before John died, we had just had the roof replaced. And in addition to the roof, there was some rotted wood that we had, replaced as part of that, like some beams and stuff like that. And so we had to repaint the house. We hadn't gotten to that yet. And so we had the roof. The roof had literally just been finished. I hadn't even paid for it yet, which the roofer definitely was one to make sure that I was going to remember to pay him. And then there was paint the house. And then there was a succession of house projects in the queue already. And then because of the flood, now there was like flood recovery. And I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to do all this? And, like our minds need something tangible to kind of help us organize. And so the puzzle metaphor came to me, and I was like, it's like somebody came and dumped like 8 to 10,000 piece puzzles, which I don't like to do, all over the floor. And like, here you go. Now you got to put them all together. And I was just like, how do I even tackle this? And I felt like God say, don't worry. Just pick up one piece at a time. I'll help you sort them out. So it's like, pick up a piece. Where does this go? There, 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 there. And we'll sort them and we'll get them put together and it's going to be okay. And I just was like, just trusting in the process and most definitely trusting in God through that whole experienced. And so that kind of helped me conceptualize what I was up against. And the thing about the puzzles was like people that do puzzles, I imagine, because I'm not a puzzle person at all, like to do one at a time. Well, because there was so many, I felt like God was saying, we're going to do an outline over here. We're going to just sort pieces over here. We're going to like come back to this one next time. And then, so it wasn't linear at all. It was like
Right.
here and then there. And so that was the first one that really kind of helped me start to organize my thoughts. And I'm a visual person, so I ended up getting a poster board, and I had all these different sticky notes. And so I would put tasks on the sticky notes, and we even had like stickers. Evie and I decorated it and stuff to try to make it kind of artsy and fun. And that was also helpful because the devastation of the house, was a reminder of what happened. And so that was really challenging. Um, a practical metaphor that I mention in the book is what I call the part-time job that you didn't ask for, you didn't want, and you're not getting paid. And I'm a very like go, 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 high productivity type of active person. And I know what my capacity normally is. I think we all do somewhere in the back of our minds. Well, in light of all the things that were now on my plate, not just from like funeral arrangements, flood recovery, other house projects, just living, and then now living without a partner because you're used to living with having somebody you can pass the baton to. All of those things were taxing my resources, and so the part-time job metaphor was a very practical one for me to realize if I had another part-time job that was taking, say, 20, 25 hours of my time per week, could I reasonably, expect that I could do the same output? Well, the answer is no.
Right.
So I kind of had to scale back, and I've used that metaphor with some of my grieving clients as well. And so there, I had to scale back. And that was helpful because, it's easy to judge yourself and like, tell yourself like you're not doing it right or what's wrong with you or whatever. And it's like, well, what's wrong with me is I'm grieving. And, I don't have the same energy level that I did before. And it just takes time.
Yeah, or the unhealthy way of just pushing yourself as hard as you can to drown out the grief and the pain and not recognize how harmful that is to you, and using that like as a coping mechanism. Again, you were
Yeah.
very intentional and very aware of what was going on within yourself, what was, you can just hear it in the way that you're describing how you were approaching this. And one of those awarenesses was like, and you had money problems. You had, people did donate to help you pay, which was a wonderful thing, to cover some of the loss that, you had to do with the repairs and the costs and stuff. But you could have easily also anxiously said to yourself, "Oh, you got to get going, girl. You can't take off time from clients. You can't cut down on
Hmm.
clients." Or you gave clients away when you realized, "I can't adequately serve this client when it's triggering my grief. I won't be a good therapist." I mean, you
Right.
you you were so willing to give yourself permission to do the right thing and to do the healthy thing without the anxiety and the worry of, "Oh my gosh, I'm not going to have money now. I've got to make as much as I can now." No, you knew that wasn't the time for that. The time for that was taking care of yourself and to allow yourself to grieve.
Right. Well, I will say, yes, people donated initially. There was a GoFundMe account, which was helped to kind of cover my initial, loss of income.
Mhm.
Other people donated like to help cover funeral costs, which was an added expense that I wasn't expecting. And then still others donated to cover my flood recovery because my insurance did not cover everything. And I did not have the bandwidth to really fight for that. And so I had to let it go. I was not happy, but I had to let it go because God provided for me and, through other means. The other thing I will say, John did have life insurance,
Mm.
and I'm a big believer in life insurance because that actually I did utilize some of those funds to kind of cover my expenses so that I could scale back and not force myself to work more.
Yeah.
And to your point about people that just kind of push through and make themselves, they distract themselves from their grieving by, working or overworking or whatever. I tell people grief is a pay me now or pay me later type of thing. So if you don't, you can put it on hold, it'll wait for you. Time itself is not the answer. Time itself does not heal our emotional wounds. It's time and intentional process. And so you have to walk through time and you have to walk through process in order to get to the other side. Otherwise, you're just delaying it. And I've seen it time and again with people that they don't face their grieving. They're not intentional or active about it. And, or another thing is sometimes they jump into another relationship, which I don't want to judge that, but that again can become another distraction that does not help them actually process their grieving.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So the cover on the book is actually a picture you took
Yes.
of, I believe it was Yosemite Falls,
Vernal Falls in
Vernal Falls
Yosemite.
in
Yeah.
Yosemite.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because you are an avid hiker, even more now than you were
Yeah.
before. But you describe it as a very healing and therapeutic exercise for you. So tell us about that.
Yeah. In fact, this morning I went on another waterfall hike to a place called Ozone Falls, and just I love waterfalls. I love being out in nature. My hiking, preceded John's death, but it really took off after. I've always enjoyed nature, and I've always seen God in nature, but the hiking metaphor, became really pronounced after John died for a few reasons. One, the types of hikes that I do, you have to pay attention to your feet, where you're putting your feet, or you're going to trip and fall. And especially in Yosemite, like the first time I was in Yosemite and like I kind of lost my head because I was oohing and eyeing, I slipped and fell. And, thankfully it wasn't a bad injury, but I realized like you have to, be mindful of your environment or you're going to fall. Like that's why people take selfies and they fall to their death
Yeah.
because they're just not being aware of their environment. And so the trails that I would take were definitely, had increased in complexity and, rougher terrain and all of that. And so the metaphor that kind of went with the hiking was that I have to really trust, my ability to my footing and the path that I'm taking, because a lot of times you take these trails and you're like, where am I going? Like there's, sometimes you just feel like there's a little bit of monotony in it and your mind can drift. And grieving can be monotonous sometimes and your mind drifts. And then all of a sudden you don't realize like what happened and why are you having, a grief attack or whatever. And so being in nature and having to be like all present mentally and paying attention was another metaphor really for like the grief journey that I was on. But it was very therapeutic because getting outdoors and breathing oxygen with all the trees around you, and just seeing the beauty, it kind of gets you outside of yourself. And so, and two, this is another thing is like paying attention to details. Like this morning, the hike that I was taking, there was all these little tiny flowers that you could just kind of be traipsing along and just not even notice. But I'm the type of hiker that I try to balance between like I don't lollygag, but I also don't like, just truck along, to try to, get mileage. So what I try to do is find a balance of like having that stop and just take in my surroundings and just really receive what my soul might need in that moment. Beauty, artistry, all of that is something that God has given to us as a means of expression and appreciation, and just like an emotional, like, deep breath, and then also an emotional exhale to just let go of all the stuff that kind of just piles onto us.
Yeah, water does that for me too. I could sit in front of a waterfall or the ocean or even a creek or a river, going over water, over the rocks or just going down. And oh, I could sit there for hours. And I am like not a person that can sit hardly at all. I don't
Mm-hmm.
usually sit still and I
Yeah.
stay busy. But I can become so just immersed in that experience. And that is therapeutic for me. When I am in a crisis in my life, like something's going on in a relationship or something that is just really stressful, I will usually go down to the ocean and just sit,
Mm.
walk by myself in a chair and just do the same thing. Just breathe deeply and just let go and journal and pray. And, it's just but everybody has a place that that happens to them. And that's a really, really therapeutic thing to do. And getting outside is absolutely healthy. Um,
Right.
so I found this to be really fun. You created new words to describe what your grief journey was like at various times. What are some of those words and what do they mean?
Yeah. So the first one that came to me was, I called it surthriving, because there were times when I was feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm just barely surviving, just overwhelmed with everything that I had to do. And then there were other times, even early on, where I felt like, okay, I'm thriving, I'm kind of thriving. How can I be thriving when I don't have my best friend anymore? Like, that just was so bizarre to me. But, so I kind of would go back and forth. And then there were times when I felt somewhere kind of in the middle where I'm like, well, I'm not quite in survival mode, but I'm not really ultimately thriving either. So that's where thriving kind of came up. And then I started like kind of getting silly with it, like I realized that there were times that I could actually feel sad and happy at the same time. And so I said, does that make me sappy or had, like, what is it? But early on, like the Lord was showing me like how these seemingly contradictory emotions can actually coexist.
Yeah.
And it kind of like it's this weaving in and out of these different emotional states. And it just is what it is. So some of the other ones I came up with, there was times when I was feeling free, like freedom and being single and not having to, consult with a partner on decisions that I made or things that I wanted to do or just anything. And then other times when I felt burdened because I didn't have a partner to share, things, tasks just company and stuff. So that one was burdened, you know,
Burden.
burdened. And then I think my favorite one was there was times like when I really felt content, with my situation, even with, my best friend being in heaven, darn it, he preceded me. So there was times when I felt content, but then also agitated. So I called it congitated,
Agitated.
not to be confused with conjugated, which is a verb, tense thing or whatever. So anyway, some of those things, like I do try to really access humor
Mhm.
to help bring levity to just the seriousness of life. Because, I don't make fun of things or mock things, but I just see the humor in them. And, sometimes like kind of combining these words together became like a little bit of a humorous exercise.
Yeah, and humor, give it a light touch, is definitely something that is a very helpful thing to do throughout any serious moment in life. and
Right.
nothing wrong with that. Uh, so you grieved, as I've said, with awareness and intention. And as I'm listening to you, I'm reminded that that takes emotional intelligence. And the first of that is to be able to feel your emotion and identify it
Right.
and describe, then to figure out, of course, how you want to respond to it. But, feeling the emotion, if you have been shut down to your emotions, is going to be really difficult through grief, but it's required. So, what are some of the things that you would say to listeners about how they can grieve with intention?
So this would be for anybody as well as people that are grieving. And I would say, number one, develop self awareness and practice it daily. And how you practice or how do you develop self awareness is, having a trusted other, whether it's a therapist or even a lay counselor or just a trusted friend that can give you honest feedback, because we are the masters of self deception. And so it's important to have people around us that can be, honest, with gentleness and with love, but honest, because sometimes we need to hear the hard stuff. And as we are teachable and humble and able to receive other people's perceptions about us, and then we can, honestly be asking the Lord, Holy Spirit, please reveal to me, what am I not seeing? If we're open to that, even if it kind of pushes on our pride or, you know stings a little bit, that is an incredibly helpful tool to move forward and to grieve, not just grieve with intention, but just live an honest life.
Mhm.
The other thing I would say that is super important is process any childhood wounds ASAP.
Yeah.
Now, at the point that John had died, I had already processed, I would say, probably the vast majority of my childhood wounds. And God had brought me through some incredibly deep and meaningful healing, emotional, spiritual healing experiences, so that when John passed away, none of that was creeping in,
Right.
because it was settled. Now, I will say, again, on a little bit of a humorous note, I felt like, I felt like all my awkward junior high experiences kind of resurfaced. In midlife, I was 48 years old when John died, and I knew how to operate as an adult in the context of being married to him. My entire adult life at that point had been shaped in the context of being in relationship with John. And so I was like, I don't know what to do with myself, and I found some of my reactions and some of my mindset and some of my responses kind of like humorous. Like, I didn't know what my boundaries were with men. you know like, do they think differently? Whatever. I mean, it's just really funny. But anyway, so processing your childhood wounds is so important, because then whatever you experience after a major loss, if you haven't processed your childhood wounds, I can guarantee you that it's going to crop up in the aftermath. um, you had mentioned emotional intelligence. I think that is incredibly important to increase your emotional intelligence. Cultivate healthy friendships is another thing. Being a part of an emotionally balanced community, like a good church, or a Bible study, or a women's group, or whatever. And if you don't know what a healthy relationship looks like, look it up online, and you can identify some key characteristics of what makes a healthy relationship. Things like appropriate boundaries, and keeping confidences, and just different stuff like that.
Yeah, I have a article. It's a devotional, but it still lists it where it talks about safe people.
Hmm.
And the safe relationship, what does that look like? And then what does a safe family relationship look like? And what is an unsafe relationship? And that's really easy to look at, at like a checklist with that. Um,
Right.
so you did get, again, with intention, even being a therapist, uh, you got a whole bunch of support, and at times, like you did it all. So,
Yeah.
um, just a note to people listening, like you need support, and So, what were some of the things that you did, and why is that important?
Yeah, absolutely. So, grief groups, both online and in-person grief groups, I accessed individual therapy with a professional therapist, and I also had a lay counselor because extra and I needed more support. I had a widow mentor, somebody who had was further along in her journey, that she was a healthy person. I could kind of bounce my angst off of. And, when I would think or feel a certain way, I could ask her, like, is this typical? Like, what am I experiencing? This and that. And then I did other things like I went and got a massage. Your body needs something. And when I was considering for both me and my daughter, like all the tension that you feel immediately after, like that needs to be released somehow. And so I went and got a massage. Now, quick little side note on that. The first time I went and got a massage after, it was with a female, and she was massaging my leg, and I just started to cry. And she was like, "Oh my gosh, are you okay?" And I said, "No, it's okay, it's okay." The thought that came into my mind when she touched my thigh was that I'm never going to feel John's hand on my thigh again. And I needed to feel that, and I needed to like acknowledge that, and I needed to express it and let it out, I also did a lot of journaling, and I used art. Like you can kind of see behind me in my office, I have some artwork, and there's a lot more that you can't see. But right initially after John died and we had to leave and go to my friend's house for a little bit while the house dried out, I brought art supplies, and I remember just like slapping paint on a canvas. Like it was so chaotic, but it was representational of what was going on inside of me, and having it out like that was actually cathartic.
Yeah.
So I really urge people to utilize a variety of means to kind of, because it's not just about talking. Artistic expression, I think, is a great medium because there's times when we can't use words, but we can use color. And you don't have to be an artist to express yourself artistically. Sometimes, if you're into sculpting, like, shaping something, like even getting some Play Doh and just, squeezing it out of frustration, or shaping it into something that represents how you're feeling in the moment. Those kinds of things can be very cathartic and releasing as well.
Yeah, and there is a Christian program called Grief Share, and I'll put that link in the notes. It did when you found a widow mentor, was that just somebody you knew personally, or was that an organization?
No, well, okay, it wasn't somebody I knew before my husband died. I went to a grief group in person at a local church, and she was actually the leader of my small group.
Okay.
And I ended up not staying at that grief group. I went to a different one, and I ended up forming a relationship with that person, and I called her my widow mentor. In fact, we're still in touch now, and this is almost 8 years later. And she's been a huge support to me as I've kind of walked through some of the chaotic ideas and responses that I've had over the years.
Yeah, what that would be an awesome idea for a ministry to have to offer widow support. I mean,
Yeah.
it sounds like in Timothy, I don't know if I think it was it Second Timothy or First Timothy, one or the other, where it talked about the older women being mentors to the younger women. Well, we to be a mentor to somebody who's gone through divorce, but also, through widowhood. And that's like a sponsor or a mentor in other programs too. So your daughter was 18, right?
Mhm.
When her dad passed away, and she was, your only child. So tell us about some of the struggles that you were aware of with her grief and with your ability to support her, and
Mhm.
some of the kind of suggestions you can give to people to support their own children who've maybe lost their father or a sibling.
Right. So right away, immediately, I'm trained in trauma therapy. I utilize EMDR. And so right away, I was kind of checking in on her to see if she had any signs of trauma. And so I use a little device called a TheraTapper, and it kind of, buzzes back and forth when you hold on to the little, paddles or whatever. And so right after, I used that with her, as we were kind of just talking. She found it to be very calming and stuff. And then, definitely, guiding her towards therapy. We did do a joint therapy session together, I think, a few days after John died. And it was very, I think it filled in some of the blanks for each of us, because we were bouncing back and forth on like what she was experiencing, what I was experiencing, what she knew, what I knew, and back and forth. And so there was a lot of helpfulness to that. Now, that being said, what I noticed was, we previous to John's death, I felt a really solid relationship. We could communicate, typical, sometimes like, snotty teenager type of thing. But we had a good solid relationship where we had open communication and all that. What I noticed was, she would snap at me, or she'd get irritated with me, um, easy. And I was feeling it too, but I was recognizing it, right away, like, oh my gosh, like I'm irritated with her because I'm angry that my husband died. And so, having to ride the waves, if you will, of her irritation, because one of the early on, I had to make decisions about his death, and I wanted to consider her feelings. So, I'm asking an 18-year-old young girl, really, like, okay, they're asking me if we want to have a open casket before we cremate him. Do you want that? And so she's forced to have to make decisions that in her young life, she never in a million years thought she'd have to make a decision. And so naturally, this was hard for her. And so I had to be patient. And I remember one conversation in particular with her where I told her, I said, Evie, I am so sorry to have to ask you this. And I know how much it hurts. And it hurts me too. And I don't want to do it. But we have to, because time is of the essence. And so we have to make a decision. And so being patient with her and not taking it personally when she was being, like snapping at me or whatever, was part of it. The other thing is, like, we went on a trip together, and I noticed that when she was around her dad's family, she was much more agitated, much more, unsettled. And so I remember during one of our trips, I just literally held her while she cried, and that, as a mom, whew, I got to tell you, that was hard. But I felt so helpless. But the next morning, when I talked to her about it, she said, no, I felt better after that. And I was like, okay. And then just being able to listen to how she's expressing her thoughts and her feelings without trying to correct her or otherwise, explain things or change her perception, even if I know it's a little off, because that's not the time to do it. She needed her own processing. And so, being, again, I think patience is a big watchword when you're dealing, with family members. And especially, like, she was older. I've worked with people that have had younger kids, and they don't, they don't readily recognize that behavior problems are often a sign of like, reactive grieving.
Uh,
And, because it's in the background, even for children. But younger children tend to have almost like an on and off switch where it's like they'll just be like off playing, like, they're just being kids. And then all of a sudden, like it'll hit them and then they're in a puddle of tears.
mhm.
And, and it might be in response to like they're playing a game with little Johnny or something, and then they get their feelings hurt. And under normal circumstances, that wouldn't be a big deal. But because they're grieving in the background, all of a sudden it's inflamed. So being aware, especially with young children, that they kind of weave in and out of that awareness of the loss, and
Yeah,
not to force it, you
right.
know. And I think that's one of the errors that some parents do is, they try to like engage their younger children with like, conversation about it, and let them, or their behavior give you a sign that this is the time to talk about it.
Yeah, because some don't want to talk as much. Depends on their personality and even their
Mm-hmm.
gender and their age, and it'll be different. But another thing they do is they regress. A child who's potty trained might all of a sudden not be potty trained, or might have
Right.
sleep together alone, and or can't sleep alone when they used to be able to sleep alone, or they start having, just baby-like behavior where they didn't do that. But there's some really good charts I've seen online where you can look at, different types of typical regression or
Mm.
ways that children react to grief at certain ages that I found really helpful when my own grandkids lost their father very young, and
Yeah.
it gives you a really good idea of just things to look out for. So as we end the podcast, what would you like to say? I know you could have a lot to say, but think about some of the things you'd like to say who are maybe grieving the loss of a loved one.
Well, I mentioned it earlier. Patience is the watchword. Um, I wouldn't even call it a marathon. You know how sometimes people use, oh, life is a marathon, not a sprint. I'm going to use the metaphor of Ironman or a triathlon, because there's different aspects to different mini seasons of grieving. So, when you're having this type of experience, you need these certain tools and this certain approach, and you're exercising these emotional muscles. And then, all of a sudden now you're shifting over to something else, much like a triathlon, right? You're swimming, running, or biking, and you're using different muscle groups to get through that particular phase of the race. And so in grief, it's similar, where it's like, okay, whereas over here, in this phase, you might be using certain emotional muscles. Well, now over here, you've got to use different ones, and you have to condition yourself. And then there's even another one. And then sometimes you're bouncing back and forth between the different phases. And so being patient is really important. And it is a long haul.
Mhm.
I'm almost 8 years into this, and I didn't realize this was going to happen. But after I finished writing the book, I had a resurgence of grief. And I was under the impression that once I wrote this story, I could just kind of be done with this. And all of a sudden, it just really, like, it just brought it all back to the surface.
Mm.
And in 2 days from today, on April 16th, it's John's birthday. And so, there's still some emotional attachment to certain anniversaries. Some of them have faded, like, things like the major holidays don't bother me anymore. I'm cool with that. But for some reason, his birthday still does. It's because it's associated with him. So
Sure.
and different people have different timelines on how long something's going to bother them.
Mhm.
Even if you don't remember, your body does. And
Yes.
so, if you find yourself extra irritated or extra impatient, make sure you're checking in with your grief, because it might be related to that and it's kind of floating in the background.
Yeah, good point. Your body knows it. even if you're not acknowledging it. Absolutely. And one of the things that I was meant to bring up when we were talking about emotional intelligence is if you struggle, if people listening focus or struggle with identifying feelings, there's all kinds of good feeling wheels on the
Hmm.
internet that give you kind of main feelings. You always say you start off with mad, sad, glad, afraid. Those are the four main ones. And then
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of subcategories of each of those. And it just kind of gives you the ability to get better at having words to describe what you're feeling. So that can be really helpful too. So there's so much more. We could do a whole one where we just talked about grief. But now, did you keep your MFT license in California? Are you licensed still here or just
Yeah,
Tennessee?
I am licensed both in California and Tennessee, at least for the next 2 years.
Okay.
I do want to eventually phase out California completely, and focus more on just people in Tennessee.
Okay, and you are an MFT, so you're not able to see people outside of the state of Tennessee. You're not also like a coach where you could do that.
No, no, I just either Tennessee or California. Those are the two states that I'm licensed in.
Okay, and you don't just see clients for grief. You also see clients with dysfunctional family situations. You see couples for marriage
Yeah.
counseling. Do you do it over Zoom also?
I offer telehealth as well as in person.
Okay.
And so yeah, and I've actually seen people from all over Tennessee. I'm closer to East Tennessee, but I've seen people from West Tennessee, which is a good 4.5 hours from me.
Okay, yeah,
So
that's doable with telehealth, which is the one good thing that came out of COVID. Is
right.
everybody's ability to understand how to get on some form of telehealth, whether it be Zoom or something else. So
Right.
thank you very much for being honest, and time went by really fast. I'm going to put the link to her website to how you so you can contact her for counseling. Also, the link to the book and some of the other resources that we mentioned. So it was wonderful to talk to you. Great to see you. It's been quite a while,
Yeah.
but we both went through our programs for becoming therapists about the same time. So we would have talks. We went to a couple kind of like seminars together to learn about different areas. And we both talked back then about, oh, I wonder what direction we were going to go. And we had no idea how life would send us, right?
Right.
God does, and God does. So thank you. I know this is going to be super helpful. So for those of you that are listening, thank you for listening and or watching this podcast on Change My Relationship. Please, please send it to those that you know that are grieving that would be helped. And also let anybody you know in Tennessee and California know of Christine as a therapist. She's awesome. So thank you, and I hope to see you next time. God bless.